The hall was magnificent, filled with rows of polished chairs and golden lights that made everything glow. The walls were tall and elegant, adorned with paintings of musicians from centuries ago. People had arrived hours early, dressed in their finest clothes. There was an air of excitement and pride, mixed with whispers of judgment. The audience was made up of music critics, professional musicians, and wealthy patrons who knew how a performance should look and sound. They were all expecting something extraordinary, but not from her. She stepped into the hall quietly, holding her small sheet music folder tightly. Her clothes were simple, plain in comparison to the fashionable attire of the others. Her shoes were worn but polished, and her hair was tied back in a practical style. She could feel eyes on her as she walked to the piano. Some stared curiously, some skeptically, and a few with amusement. She had noticed the famous pianist in the front row even before she entered. His reputation was well known. He was arrogant, confident, and used to being the center of attention. The way he laughed and whispered to his friends as he looked at her made her heart pound. She took a deep breath and approached the grand piano, her fingers brushing lightly against its polished surface. The piano gleamed under the warm lights, reflecting her nervous face back at her. She opened her folder and laid out her music, her hands steady despite the racing thoughts in her mind. In the audience, the famous pianist leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He whispered something to his companion, and a few people near him chuckled. The laughter felt sharp, almost cutting through her confidence, but she kept her head high and ignored it. She had worked too hard to let a few mocking words shake her. The room was buzzing with anticipation, the soft rustle of clothing and whispered conversations filling the space. People adjusted their seating, sipped water, and murmured about who was performing next. She noticed the subtle glances and raised eyebrows, but she focused on the piano in front of her. She knew that once her hands touched the keys, nothing else would matter. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the silence of the hall settle around her. This was her moment, the result of years of practice and dedication, even if no one here yet understood it. Memories of her journey flooded her mind. She remembered the small apartment where she had learned to play, a place with thin walls and a creaky floor. There were no grand pianos, no mentors in fancy suits, just her determination and a second-hand keyboard that had seen better days. Many nights she had stayed up late practicing until her fingers ached, until the sounds of the music blended with her heartbeat. She had faced ridicule before, people telling her she would never perform in front of an audience like this. Yet here she was, standing in one of the grandest halls she had ever seen, ready to prove them wrong. The famous pianist shifted in his seat and leaned closer to the edge of his chair. He was watching her every movement, his eyes full of judgment. He made a subtle gesture with his hand as if to say, "Show us what you've got," but in a mocking tone. She noticed it, but instead of being distracted, it fueled her focus. She reminded herself that talent was not about appearances, nor about how many people laughed or doubted you. It was about the connection between your hands, your heart, and the instrument. The piano in front of her was not just wood and strings. It was a bridge to express her emotions, her years of practice, and her love for music. The audience began to settle down, sensing the performance was about to start. Conversation softened, and the hall became quiet except for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional cough. She placed her hands on the keys lightly, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingertips. The piano seemed alive, ready to respond to every thought and emotion she poured into it. She could feel the tension in the room, a mix of expectation and skepticism. Everyone was waiting to see if she could live up to the standards of the elite musicians present. And some, especially the famous pianist, were expecting failure. Despite the tension, she felt a calm resolve. She reminded herself that this moment was not about impressing anyone with grandeur or showmanship. It was about honesty, about playing music that spoke from her soul. She could hear the faint echoes of her past performances in her mind. The notes that once seemed small and unnoticed, now leading her to this very stage. Each step she had taken, each hour of practice, and each moment of doubt had prepared her for this instant. As she prepared to begin, she noticed a few people in the audience leaning forward, curiosity replacing their initial skepticism. Some were young musicians themselves, inspired by the courage it took to stand there despite the mocking whispers. She realized that her performance would not only be for the critics and the wealthy patrons, but also for anyone who had ever been doubted, laughed at, or underestimated. This thought gave her a quiet strength. The famous pianist, still smirking, tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest, clearly eager to see her falter. The contrast between his confidence and her quiet determination was striking. He did not realize that her strength was not in arrogance but in preparation, passion, and authenticity. She could feel his gaze, heavy and judgmental, but it did not intimidate her. She had faced much harsher critics before, and had learned to let the music speak louder than words. Her heart beat steadily as she positioned herself in front of the keys. The hall seemed to hold its breath along with her. The grand piano waited, the strings and hammers poised to translate her emotions into sound. She took one final deep breath, letting the years of practice and the quiet nights of dedication fill her with confidence. The audience, unaware of the story behind her nerves, waited for the first note. In that brief moment, the hall was suspended in anticipation, the contrast between doubt and potential palpable in the air. She could hear the faint shuffle of feet, the soft breathing of those seated, and the subtle hum of expectation. The mocking laughter of the famous pianist now felt distant, almost irrelevant. Her focus was complete. Her connection with the piano was absolute. Every fiber of her being was ready to translate her journey, her emotions, and her talent into music that would speak for itself. As she positioned her fingers above the keys, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It was not an easy path. It had been filled with obstacles, people who doubted her, and moments when giving up would have been easier. But she had persevered, driven by a love for music that no criticism could diminish. This moment was the culmination of all those efforts, the silent triumph of dedication over doubt. The audience's chatter had almost ceased, replaced by an expectant silence. Every eye in the hall was on her now, some with doubt, some with curiosity, and some with anticipation they did not yet understand. The famous pianist's smirk had faded slightly, replaced by an intrigued, almost wary expression. He did not yet know the power of the young woman before him, the depth of her talent, or the emotional intensity that she could convey with a single touch of the keys. She closed her eyes for a brief second, centering herself. She imagined the piano as an extension of herself, a tool to communicate what words never could. The years of lonely practice, the small triumphs and failures, all had led to this moment. She was ready to play not for the approval of the skeptics, not for fame or recognition, but for the love of music itself. The thought grounded her, filling her with quiet strength. The hall remained silent, every spectator leaning in slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The famous pianist shifted in his seat, still confident, but now with a hint of curiosity. He did not yet understand that her skill was not defined by appearances or background, but by heart, dedication, and the depth of understanding that came from years of pure passion. With one final, steadying breath, she prepared to lift her fingers above the keys. The air felt charged, heavy with expectation, yet calm within her own mind. She knew that the moment she struck the first note, everything would change. The mocking whispers, the judgmental glances, the doubt of the audience, all would be confronted by the truth of her music. She was ready. The piano waited, poised to transform her story into sound, ready to speak in a language that transcended criticism, arrogance, and skepticism. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift back to the countless days she had spent alone, practicing with nothing but her determination and the faint hum of the small keyboard in her apartment. The walls were thin, and she had often worried about making too much noise, but she had kept playing, driven by a love for the music that nothing could shake. Each note she had played in those quiet nights had taught her more than any teacher ever could. Each mistake had been a lesson, each triumph a reminder of why she continued. It was these quiet hours that had built the foundation for her skill and resilience. The hall around her seemed to fade away as she focused on the piano in front of her. The polished surface reflected the warm lights, the golden accents, and the expectant faces, but all she saw was the instrument itself. She could almost hear it breathing, as if it knew she was ready to pour her soul into its keys. The grand piano was unlike the one she had learned on, larger and more elegant, but she felt no fear. Instead, there was excitement, a feeling of finally meeting a friend she had only imagined in her dreams. She felt the weight of the audience's eyes, but it was not pressure she feared. It was awareness. Every person in the room had their own expectations, their own judgments. Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few openly dismissive. She could feel the famous pianist's gaze, sharp and calculating, as if he were searching for any sign of weakness. Yet rather than faltering, she felt a quiet determination building inside her. She knew that her skill was not measured by the opinions of others, but by the truth of her music and the clarity of her expression. Her mind wandered to the small moments that had shaped her journey. She remembered the day she had first touched a piano in a music shop. The sound had been magical, resonating deep in her chest. She had begged her parents to buy her a small keyboard, and though it had been old and out of tune, she had cherished it. She had spent hours discovering the sounds, the patterns, the emotions hidden in each key. It had been the beginning of a long journey, one filled with trials, doubts, and breakthroughs that no one outside her small world could understand. Now, in the grandeur of the concert hall, those small beginnings seemed far away, yet they were the core of her strength. The hardships she had endured, the ridicule she had faced, and the lonely nights of practice were not obstacles but stepping stones. Every challenge had taught her patience, focus, and the power of persistence. She knew that the audience would never fully understand the effort behind her fingers, but that did not matter. The music she was about to play was her voice, her story, and it required no validation from anyone but herself. She adjusted her posture, ensuring her fingers hovered lightly over the keys. She felt the cool surface against her fingertips and a calm focus settled over her. In that moment, she was no longer a nervous young woman in a hall full of critics. She was a conduit for the music that had lived inside her for so long. The famous pianist leaned back in his chair, still confident, but now a flicker of curiosity crossed his face. He could sense, perhaps, that this performance might not follow the predictable path he had imagined. The audience had grown quiet, sensing that the performance was about to begin. The faint rustle of clothing and shifting of chairs had stopped, replaced by a charged stillness. The expectation was palpable, yet she did not feel rushed or pressured. She felt a deep connection to the piano and to the music she was about to play. It was a moment suspended in time, where past and present converged, and the result depended entirely on the honesty and depth of her expression. Her mind revisited the times she had been underestimated, teachers who had dismissed her abilities, friends who had teased her for spending so much time on a keyboard, and strangers who had laughed at her ambition. All of them had fueled a quiet determination. It was not anger that drove her, but a deep desire to prove to herself and silently to the world that dedication and love for one's craft could overcome any barrier. She understood that talent alone was not enough. Perseverance, resilience, and a willingness to endure hardship were the true markers of mastery. The grand piano before her seemed to respond to her touch even before her fingers pressed the keys. She could imagine the vibrations, the resonance, the subtle emotions that would emerge with each chord. Her mind was clear, focused, and attuned to the intricate dance between intention and sound. She was aware of the famous pianist's gaze, sharp and assessing, yet it no longer intimidated her. He represented the world she had longed to enter, the standards she aimed to meet, and now she was ready to step into that light with confidence. She reflected on the importance of listening, of feeling the music rather than simply playing notes. She had learned that technique alone was hollow without emotion. Every note must carry intention, every pause must have meaning. It was this understanding that had allowed her to grow beyond a simple student into a true musician. She had spent years practicing not for applause or recognition, but to reach a place where the piano and her soul were one. That connection was now her greatest strength. The anticipation in the hall had reached a silent crescendo. Every individual, whether critic or admirer, leaned slightly forward in expectation. She felt a thrill in this collective focus, a shared moment of possibility. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for her to release the first note. And she knew that when she did, nothing would ever be quite the same. The music she carried within her was more than skill. It was life, emotion, and story woven into sound. The famous pianist, for all his confidence, did not yet realize the depth of her preparation. He had underestimated the years of practice, the quiet struggles, and the moments of self-doubt that had sharpened her skill. Her strength was invisible, built in the unseen hours that no one would witness until the keys spoke. She understood that true mastery often appeared effortless, and now she was ready to demonstrate it. She could feel the energy of the audience. Their skepticism mingled with curiosity, pressing against her consciousness. It was a reminder that the world often judges too quickly, assumes too soon, and overlooks the potential hidden in quiet dedication. She welcomed it, for it was the perfect contrast to her prepared mind. The tension, the doubt, the expectation, they all made the music she was about to play even more meaningful. As her fingers hovered above the keys, she thought of the countless people who had told her she would never perform in a hall like this. She thought of the neighbors who had complained about her late-night practice, the peers who had laughed at her dedication, and the moments when she had questioned her own path. Yet here she was, standing tall, ready to channel all of those experiences into a single defining performance. She was no longer seeking permission to exist in this world of music. She was claiming her place in it. The hall seemed to quiet even further, the heavy air charged with expectation. She could hear the faintest breaths, the subtle movements of the audience, each person unknowingly holding on to the moment before it exploded into sound. She let herself feel the weight of it, the thrill of anticipation and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are prepared. This was more than a performance, it was a culmination of years of learning, growing, and believing in something bigger than yourself. Her mind settled on the first note she would play. It had to be perfect, not in the sense of technical perfection, but in the sense that it must carry meaning, clarity, and emotion. Every ounce of her preparation led to this point. Her body relaxed, her fingers poised, her heart steady. She was ready to transform the tension of the room, the doubts of the audience, and the weight of her own expectations into music that would speak for itself. She reminded herself that this performance was not about competing with the famous pianist or anyone else in the room. It was about honesty, expression, and the pure joy of sharing music. The piano before her was a partner, a storyteller, and an extension of her emotions. Each key was a word, each chord a sentence, and the music as a whole a narrative that only she could tell. She felt a deep respect for the instrument, for the space, and for the people who had come to witness her, and with that respect came an unwavering resolve. As she prepared to strike the keys, a quiet smile formed on her face. She felt a mixture of nerves and excitement, but above all she felt readiness. The famous pianist's eyes were fixed on her, his expression one of calculated interest now rather than mere amusement. He was beginning to sense that her talent might surpass appearances, that the years of dedication could translate into something extraordinary. Yet he still did not know the depth, the precision, and the passion she had cultivated in secret. She allowed herself a moment of stillness, absorbing the atmosphere of the hall and the shared anticipation of the audience. Every doubt, every judgment, every whisper of ridicule had brought her to this point, sharpening her focus and strengthening her resolve. She understood that the first note would carry the weight of all that preparation, all that experience, and all that hope. It was a simple note, but it would be enough to shift the energy of the room, to command attention, and to tell the story she had been longing to share. Her fingers touched the keys lightly, feeling the cold, smooth surface and the faint resistance beneath her touch. She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady and sure. She took a final, steadying breath and gently pressed her finger down on the first key. The note rang out, pure and clear, filling the hall with a resonance that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. It was a single, simple note, yet it carried weight. It was confident, full of intention, and rich with emotion. In that instant, the hall went silent. All the murmurs, laughter, and whispered judgments vanished as if they had never existed. Even the famous pianist froze in his seat, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, caught off guard by the strength and clarity of that first sound. The note vibrated through the polished wood of the floor, into the walls and into the hearts of everyone present. It was not loud or showy, but it had presence. It demanded attention without demanding it, commanding respect without arrogance. The audience, initially skeptical, found themselves leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the unexpected power of this simple act. The young woman's hands hovered lightly above the keys, ready to continue. Yet she let the note linger just long enough for everyone to feel its significance. The famous pianist's smirk had disappeared completely. He had expected nervousness, hesitation, or a mistake, something to validate his mockery. But what he saw and heard was mastery disguised as simplicity. The arrogance in his gaze softened into astonishment. He shifted in his seat, eyes following her every movement, trying to reconcile what he had assumed about her with the undeniable reality of her skill. The room had transformed from a place of judgment to a space filled with anticipation, curiosity, and awe. She felt the silence surrounding her, not as pressure, but as connection. The energy in the hall was palpable, almost tangible, as though the audience itself was holding its collective breath. Each person was now present, attentive, and engaged. This single note had broken through the barrier of doubt, suspending time and expectation, and allowing everyone to witness the power of dedication and emotion. It was a reminder that music at its core is about feeling, about the human experience, not just technical perfection. Memories of her practice sessions flooded her mind again. Every hour spent learning to shape a note, to give it life and meaning, had prepared her for this exact moment. The countless nights of repetition, the frustration of missed notes, and the quiet triumphs of progress had all contributed to the mastery she now displayed effortlessly. She had learned that true music comes from understanding the weight behind every sound, the story that every vibration carries. That understanding was now evident in the single note that had silenced the entire hall. The audience could feel it. Critics who had prepared to scoff, wealthy patrons who had doubted, and musicians who had expected a simple display of incompetence, all were united in a moment of unexpected reverence. The note did not just fill the space, it filled the minds and hearts of those listening. It was a quiet but undeniable statement. She was a musician whose skill and emotion could not be ignored. The famous pianist, usually composed and untouchable, leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together, as though bracing himself for the truth he had yet to fully grasp. She allowed the note to fade naturally, feeling the response of the piano beneath her fingertips. It was alive, responding to her touch with a resonance that mirrored her own heartbeat. In that single sustained tone, she had communicated more than words ever could. The audience felt it too, a shared understanding that something remarkable was unfolding before them. The simple act of playing one note had shifted perceptions, transforming skepticism into admiration, judgment into wonder. Her mind was focused, clear, and centered. She was aware of the famous pianist's gaze, the subtle movements of the audience, and the way the energy in the hall had shifted. Yet she did not let it distract her. She knew that her skill was not measured by reactions but by the integrity of her expression. Every note she played, every sound she produced was an extension of herself. The first note had set the tone, establishing her presence and intent, but it was only the beginning. She was ready to unfold the story, to let the music speak in its full depth. She remembered the moments in her journey when she had been underestimated. Friends and acquaintances had laughed at her dedication. Teachers had doubted her potential, and strangers had assumed her aspirations were beyond her reach. Those experiences, while painful at the time, had taught her resilience, patience, and focus. They had shaped her understanding that true talent is often hidden until revealed through perseverance and commitment. The single note she had played now embodied all of that learning, all of that quiet strength that had been cultivated over years. The hall remained completely silent, every listener caught in the magic of the moment. It was as if the music had created a bridge between her and the audience, a connection that bypassed language, expectation, and judgment. She could sense it in the subtle leaning forward of some listeners, the widened eyes of others, and the slight shifts of those who had initially dismissed her. The power of the note was not in its complexity but in its clarity, its emotional resonance, and the authenticity it carried. The famous pianist now fully understood that this young woman was no ordinary performer. He had underestimated her not because he lacked skill, but because he assumed appearances and background dictated ability. Yet here she was, standing before him, commanding the attention of the entire hall with a single note. He could feel the undeniable truth. Mastery was not about confidence alone. It was about dedication, understanding, and the ability to convey emotion through every sound. She had all of that in abundance. The note began to fade slowly, leaving a soft echo that lingered in the ears and minds of the audience. It was a moment suspended in time, a pause that allowed everyone to absorb the significance of what had just occurred. She took a small, deliberate breath, feeling the anticipation building for the next sound. She knew that this moment had created an opening, a space where the audience was now fully receptive to her music. She could sense their curiosity, their wonder, and their newfound respect. Her hands remained poised above the keys, ready to continue, but she allowed the silence to speak for itself for a few moments longer. It was a delicate balance, letting the impact of the note resonate while preparing for the journey ahead. She was aware that every subsequent sound would build upon this foundation, creating a narrative that would carry the audience through her story, her emotions, and her skill. The first note was only the beginning, but it had already transformed the energy in the hall, She thought of the countless hours she had spent learning to control tone, to shape each note and to express emotion through sound. It was not enough to play the correct keys. The music had to breathe, to carry feeling, to tell a story. That understanding was what set her apart, what had allowed the first note to have such an immediate and profound effect. It was the culmination of years of listening, observing and feeling the music deeply, and now it was manifesting in the most tangible way. The audience, previously distracted by expectation and skepticism, was now entirely engaged. They were not just hearing a note, they were feeling it, sensing the dedication, the journey, and the authenticity behind it. The famous pianist, usually composed and unshakable, could not hide his astonishment. He had expected a performance that matched his assumptions, yet he was witnessing something far greater. He leaned forward, as if trying to absorb every detail, every nuance, and every subtle emotional thread that the note carried. She felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not from the audience's reaction, but from the truth of the sound she had produced. It was exactly what she had intended, pure, clear, and emotionally resonant. The note had spoken without words, communicating her dedication, her experience, and her mastery. She knew that the path ahead would continue to challenge her, but for this moment, she had created a bridge between herself and everyone listening. The hall remained enveloped in silence, a collective breath held in anticipation of what would come next. Every person, whether critic, musician, or casual listener, was fully present, fully aware, and fully engaged. The young woman had transformed the space with a single note, capturing the attention and respect of all who were present. It was a reminder of the power of authenticity, preparation, and emotional truth in music. She had not needed to prove anything with complexity or speed. She had simply expressed herself fully, and the hall had responded. Her fingers hovered lightly above the keys, ready to continue the journey she had begun. She felt the resonance of the piano, the energy of the audience, and the quiet thrill of connection. Every sound she would play from this point forward would build upon the foundation of that first note, creating a narrative that was both personal and universal. She understood the responsibility and the opportunity, and she was fully prepared to meet it. The hall had gone silent, but it was a silence full of expectation, curiosity, and reverence. She was ready to transform it into music. She let the first note fade fully before beginning to play the next one, allowing the resonance to settle in the hearts of the audience. Her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, producing a melody that was both delicate and powerful. Each note was deliberate, shaped with emotion and intent, carrying her years of practice and understanding. The hall seemed to breathe with her, each listener held in rapt attention. The music was no longer just sound. It was a living, moving story, unfolding in real time, connecting every person present to her journey. The famous pianist sat forward in his seat, eyes fixed on her hands. His usual composure was gone, replaced by focused attention. He had expected a simple, unremarkable performance, something that would amuse him and his companions. Instead, he was witnessing skill, control, and emotion intertwined seamlessly. Her hands danced across the keys, producing complex patterns that seemed effortless, yet were precise and calculated. It was clear that her talent was not just natural ability, but the result of relentless dedication and practice. She could feel the energy of the audience responding to every phrase she played. Some leaned forward in their seats, caught by the nuance of her timing. Others closed their eyes, letting the music fill their thoughts and emotions. The critics, who had been prepared to write dismissive reviews, now sat silently, captivated by the depth and clarity of her expression. The young woman's confidence grew with each passing note, but it was quiet and calm, grounded in years of preparation and self-belief. Memories of her struggles surfaced as she continued to play. She remembered the small apartment where she had practiced late into the night, her fingers aching and her body tired. She remembered the times she had been laughed at, dismissed, or told she would never make it. Each hardship had strengthened her, teaching her patience, resilience, and the value of persistence. Every note she now played carried the weight of those experiences, a testament to the journey that had brought her to this stage. The music began to build in intensity, weaving together soft, gentle passages with powerful resonant chords. She allowed herself to be fully present in the performance, feeling each note, each transition, and each silence. The audience was swept along with her, experiencing the highs and lows of her music as though it were their own story being told. The hall itself seemed to respond to her, the acoustics amplifying the emotion and nuance in every sound. She glanced briefly at the famous pianist. He had stopped trying to hide his astonishment. His eyes followed her every movement, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. It was clear he was realizing the depth of her talent, the precision of her technique, and the emotional resonance she conveyed effortlessly. He had laughed at her before, assuming that her appearance and simplicity reflected her skill, but now he could see the truth. She was a musician of rare ability, capable of touching hearts with her music. As she continued to play, she focused on the story she wanted to tell through her music. It was a tale of struggle, perseverance, and triumph, built on years of dedication and unrelenting practice. Each chord reflected a challenge she had overcome, each melody line a quiet victory. The audience could feel it. They were not just hearing a performance, they were experiencing her journey. The music bridged the gap between performer and listener, allowing them to understand her dedication and emotion without words. Her fingers moved across the keys with grace and precision, transitioning smoothly from one section to another. She played with a mixture of power and delicacy, demonstrating technical skill without ever appearing mechanical. Each note was intentional, each pause meaningful. She knew that music was not just about speed or complexity, but about conveying emotion and capturing the listener's attention. She had mastered the art of balance, and it was evident in every sound that filled the hall. The audience was mesmerized. Some closed their eyes to fully absorb the music, while others watched in awe, unable to look away. The famous pianist remained focused, his expression a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He had never expected such mastery from someone he had mocked before. Every gesture of her hands, every subtle shift in tempo, demonstrated not only her technical skill but her emotional depth. She was telling a story that transcended words, a story that resonated deeply with everyone listening. She felt a sense of flow, as if she and the piano were one entity. The music was no longer just a sequence of notes. It was a living conversation, a dialogue between her and the instrument. She responded to the subtle nuances in sound, the vibrations beneath her fingers, and the emotional resonance that each note carried. It was a performance that required complete focus, total presence, and deep emotional connection, and she was fully immersed in it. Her mind wandered briefly to the people who had doubted her, the voices that had mocked her dedication. She did not let anger or resentment influence her performance. Instead, she used those memories as fuel for expression. Each note carried a quiet strength, a reflection of her resilience and commitment. The audience could feel it, even if they did not know the details of her journey. The music spoke for itself, conveying emotion and authenticity in every sound. The hall remained completely silent except for the music. Every person was absorbed in the performance, caught up in the intricate melodies and emotional depth. She could feel their collective attention, their curiosity, and their growing admiration. The famous pianist, for all his experience and skill, could not hide his astonishment. He leaned slightly forward, taking in every detail, every nuance, as if trying to learn from the unexpected brilliance before him. The music began to shift in tone, moving from delicate passages to bold, expressive chords. She allowed herself to explore dynamics and emotion fully, conveying contrast, tension, and release. The audience was taken on a journey, experiencing moments of quiet reflection followed by powerful crescendos that resonated through the hall. It was clear that she was not simply playing notes. She was telling a story, sharing her journey and inviting the listeners to feel every emotion along with her. She felt a deep connection with the audience. Even those who had been skeptical moments ago were now engaged, caught up in the flow of the music. Some were moved to tears, others to silent admiration, but all were affected by the authenticity and passion she conveyed. The famous pianist's expression had softened into one of respect and awe. He understood now that her skill was not superficial or accidental. It was the result of years of dedication, emotional intelligence, and a profound connection to the music. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, producing complex passages with clarity and precision. Yet despite the technical difficulty, she played with ease, making the music appear natural and unforced. Every note was shaped carefully, each pause calculated to enhance the emotional impact. She understood that true mastery lay not just in the ability to play difficult passages, but in the ability to communicate meaning, emotion, and story through every sound. The audience was completely captivated. The initial skepticism had vanished, replaced by admiration and awe. Critics who had been ready to dismiss her performance now watched silently, unable to deny the skill and emotion she conveyed. The famous pianist had stopped any pretense of superiority, recognizing that he was witnessing a remarkable talent, one that transcended expectations and assumptions. She continued to build the performance, weaving together technical skill, emotional depth, and narrative clarity. Each section of music flowed naturally into the next, creating a seamless journey that engaged the audience fully. She could feel the hall responding to her, the vibrations of the piano resonating through the floor and walls, amplifying the impact of each note. The audience felt it too, swept along by the power and beauty of the music. The performance was more than a display of technical ability. It was an expression of her life, her struggles and her triumphs. Every note, every chord, and every pause carried meaning. She had transformed her experiences, both joyful and painful, into sound that could be felt and understood by everyone in the room. The famous pianist could no longer hide his admiration. He leaned forward, fully engaged, recognizing the rare combination of skill, dedication, and emotional intelligence that she possessed. As she continued, she allowed herself to be fully present, letting the music flow naturally from her fingers. Each note was a reflection of her journey, each phrase a glimpse into her heart and mind. The audience remained captivated, completely absorbed in the story she was telling through the piano. She had not just played music. She had created an experience, one that connected everyone present through emotion, skill, and authenticity. Her performance was a testament to the power of perseverance, dedication, and love for one's craft. She had faced doubt, ridicule, and obstacles, yet she had remained committed to her passion. Now in this grand hall, she was able to share the results of that commitment with the world. The audience could feel it, and the famous pianist could not deny it. She had proven without a word that true mastery is not defined by appearance, status, or expectation, but by dedication, understanding, and the ability to convey emotion through music. As the piece continued, she felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose. The audience was engaged, the music flowed naturally, and the connection between performer and listener. The music continued to flow, each note carefully chosen, each chord imbued with meaning. She played with precision, but there was a softness, a vulnerability that made the performance feel alive and human. The audience, who had come expecting entertainment, found themselves drawn into a story they could feel. The critics leaned in, their pens paused as if afraid to miss a single detail. Even those who had come for leisure were now completely absorbed, caught in the magic that had transformed the hall. The famous pianist, once arrogant and dismissive, sat silently, unable to hide his amazement. He had laughed before, believing her to be a novice, but now he was witnessing a rare combination of technical mastery and emotional depth. He watched her hands glide over the keys, her fingers moving with effortless grace and strength. Every transition was smooth, every chord perfectly timed. But more than that, there was an honesty in her music, a truth that resonated with everyone listening. He could see now that she was not only skilled but also deeply connected to her craft. She remembered the moments that had led her here, the nights spent practicing alone, the small victories and the many mistakes that had taught her resilience. Each hardship had shaped her. Each challenge had strengthened her focus and determination. And now every one of those experiences was visible in the music she produced. Her performance was not just about skill. It was about life, struggle, perseverance, and triumph, all conveyed without a single word. The hall seemed to hold its breath as she moved through the piece. The soft passages were delicate, almost whispering secrets, while the louder sections carried a boldness that demanded attention. The contrast created a tension and release that mirrored the journey she had taken as a musician. Every person in the audience could feel it, whether consciously or not. The famous pianist had stopped analyzing her technique and was now simply absorbing the beauty and power of her expression. She allowed herself a brief moment to feel the music fully, to let her own emotions guide her fingers. It was not enough to play the notes. She had to let the music breathe, to give it life and meaning. She thought of the people who had doubted her, who had laughed or underestimated her, not with anger or resentment, but with quiet strength. She allowed her experiences to shape the sound. Each chord, each melody carried the weight of her journey, the struggles she had faced, and the determination that had brought her here. The audience was visibly moved. Some closed their eyes to immerse themselves in the sound, others leaned forward, captivated by the intricacies of the performance. The critics, who had prepared to dismiss her, could no longer ignore the truth. Every movement of her hands, every subtle variation in tempo, told a story that could not be denied. She had transformed the hall into a space of shared emotion, a place where every listener could feel the depth of her dedication and the honesty of her expression. The famous pianist, whose judgment had once been harsh, now looked at her with respect and awe. He realized that talent could not be measured by appearances, that true skill was revealed not in arrogance or showmanship, but in the quiet, persistent work of those who loved their craft. She had proven this with every note, every pause, and every phrase. He was no longer the one in control of the room. She was, not through dominance, but through the undeniable power of her music. She continued to build the performance, weaving together complex patterns with simplicity and elegance. Her fingers moved with precision and sensitivity, allowing the piano to sing. Each note resonated, creating a rich tapestry of sound that filled every corner of the hall. The audience was spellbound, caught in a wave of emotion and admiration. They were not merely observing a performance. They were participating in an experience, one that touched hearts and stirred emotions. She could feel the energy of the room, the collective attention and engagement of the audience. It was as if the hall itself was alive, responding to the music with a subtle vibration that echoed through the floor and walls. The connection between performer and audience was tangible, a shared understanding that transcended words. She was not just playing for herself or for approval. She was playing to communicate, to share a piece of her soul, and to make the listeners feel what she had felt during her journey. The famous pianist watched closely, learning from her approach, the fluidity of her movements, and the depth of her emotional expression. He had underestimated her, assuming that her simplicity would reflect a lack of skill. Now he understood that true artistry was not about appearances or bravado, but about authenticity, preparation, and the ability to touch hearts. She had challenged his assumptions without a word, letting her music do all the talking. She allowed herself to smile slightly as she played, feeling the joy of connection with the piano and the audience. The performance was more than a demonstration of technical skill. It was an expression of her life, her growth, and her triumph over doubt. Every note carried intention, every pause had significance, and every chord was infused with emotion. She had transformed her experiences, both painful and joyful, into sound that could be felt by everyone in the hall. The audience remained captivated, fully present in the moment. They could feel the journey she had taken, the dedication that had brought her here, and the honesty of her expression. The critics had stopped writing notes and were instead listening intently, recognizing the rarity of what they were witnessing. The famous pianist leaned forward, absorbing the performance with an intensity he had never shown before. He had been proven wrong, not through argument or confrontation, but through the undeniable power of her music. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her efforts and dedication were being recognized, even if silently, by those who had doubted her. The music was no longer just notes on a page. It was a reflection of her journey, a story told through sound and a testament to the perseverance and love for her craft. Every phrase, every rhythm carried meaning beyond the technical, resonating deeply with the listeners. As she continued, she allowed the music to ebb and flow naturally, guiding the audience through moments of tension and release. She experimented with dynamics, tempo, and expression, creating a performance that was both technically impressive and emotionally compelling. Each listener was drawn into the narrative, experiencing the highs and lows, the challenges and triumphs as if they were part of her story. The hall had transformed into a space where music and emotion intertwined seamlessly. She reflected on the power of music to communicate what words cannot. The audience could feel her struggles, her triumphs, and her passion without needing explanation. She had used her skill, dedication, and emotional understanding to create an experience that transcended language, status, and expectation. The famous pianist, for all his experience, recognized the truth in her performance and the rare talent she possessed. He had underestimated her, but now he could not deny the mastery before him. The performance reached a climactic point, where her fingers danced across the keys with a mix of precision and freedom. The music swelled, filling every corner of the hall, capturing the attention and hearts of the audience completely. Each note resonated with clarity and emotion, creating a sense of movement and life. The audience was fully engaged, experiencing the journey she had crafted with skill, passion, and dedication. The famous pianist watched, completely captivated, recognizing that he had been humbled by a performer who had exceeded all expectations. She allowed herself to be fully present, embracing the energy of the hall and the shared experience with the audience. Each note was an extension of her, a reflection of her journey and her emotions. She had transformed doubt into admiration, skepticism into respect, and anticipation into wonder. The music spoke for itself, carrying the weight of her experience and the depth of her talent. Every listener could feel it, and the famous pianist, now fully aware of her skill, could only watch in awe. The performance began to wind down, each note carefully chosen to create a sense of closure and reflection. She slowed the tempo gently, allowing the music to settle and resonate within the hall. The audience remained silent, absorbing the final phrases, moved by the journey they had just witnessed. The famous pianist leaned back, his expression a mixture of respect, amazement, and newfound understanding. He had laughed before, but now he could see the truth. She was a musician of extraordinary ability, capable of touching hearts and minds with every sound. As the final note faded, the hall remained quiet for a moment, as if reluctant to break the spell. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room, growing louder and louder. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping, some with tears in their eyes. The critics, once skeptical, joined in, recognizing the brilliance and emotional power of the performance. The famous pianist stood as well, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement for the talent that had silenced the hall and captured everyone's hearts. She smiled humbly, acknowledging the applause without taking it for granted. She had not played for recognition or validation, but the response of the audience was a powerful affirmation of her dedication, skill, and emotional connection to music. The performance had not only showcased her talent, but it also told her story, a story of perseverance, resilience, and the transformative power of passion. The applause still echoed through the hall when she finally lifted her hands from the keys. She allowed herself a moment to take it all in, the realization that she had captivated every person in the room, including the famous pianist who had once mocked her. The warmth and sincerity of the applause was overwhelming, but it was more than recognition, it was understanding. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her journey, the hardships, the late nights, and the quiet moments of self-doubt, all culminating in this one perfect expression of her art. She glanced around the hall, seeing faces illuminated with emotion. Some were teary, some smiling in awe, and some simply silent, overwhelmed by the depth of what they had just experienced. This moment was larger than any single performance. It was a connection, a bridge between her life, her music, and the people who had witnessed her journey. She had not merely played notes on a piano, she had spoken through them, sharing pieces of her soul and inviting others to feel what she had felt. The famous pianist stood as well, the expression on his face impossible to read fully. There was respect there, yes, but also a humbled realization. He had mocked her, assuming her simplicity meant weakness, but now he understood that true artistry is far deeper than appearances. Talent is cultivated, nurtured, and tested in ways the world often overlooks. And she had proven, without a word, that years of dedication, passion, and honesty could surpass arrogance, expectation, and superficial judgment. She moved slowly from the piano, bowing modestly to the audience. The applause swelled again, louder this time, echoing through the grand hall as if every corner had absorbed the performance and reflected it back tenfold. She felt a surge of gratitude, not for the recognition alone, but for the acknowledgement of her truth, the recognition of her commitment, and the connection that music had made possible between herself and every listener. As she stepped back, she thought of the long journey that had brought her here. Every late night in her small apartment, every critique, every moment of doubt had contributed to the strength and skill she now displayed effortlessly. Each challenge had taught her patience, perseverance, and the quiet power of persistence. And now in this moment, the culmination of those experiences was visible to all. She had transformed hardship into beauty, effort into expression, and expectation into revelation. The audience began to settle, though many continued to look toward her in admiration. People whispered to each other about the unexpected brilliance, some expressing disbelief that such talent could emerge so quietly, without prior fame or recognition. She listened, not seeking validation, but quietly acknowledging the truth of their reactions. This was what she had aimed to achieve. A moment where music could speak, where emotion could be felt, and where authenticity could shine through every note. The famous pianist finally approached her, his steps measured and careful. There was a quiet dignity in the way he extended his hand, not with arrogance but with respect. She met his gaze, seeing a shift from skepticism to acknowledgement. Words were not necessary. The handshake, the nod, and the brief smile conveyed a shared understanding. She had earned his respect not through confrontation, but through the undeniable truth of her performance. He spoke quietly, enough for only her to hear. "I underestimated you. Your talent is extraordinary. I misjudged you." There was sincerity in his voice, a humility she had not expected from someone of his stature. She nodded, accepting the words with quiet grace. This was not about triumphing over someone else. It was about being true to herself, and now through her music that truth had been recognized. The rest of the audience watched silently, sensing the significance of the moment. Here was not just a performer, but a person who had proven the power of dedication, authenticity, and resilience. They were witnessing something rare, a display of courage and mastery that extended beyond the music itself. The applause returned, renewed and sustained, this time mixed with cheers and words of admiration. The hall was alive with recognition, not for fame or showmanship, but for the honesty and excellence that had been displayed. She allowed herself a deep breath, absorbing the energy and emotion of the room. Every listener had been transformed in some way, even the critics who had been forced to reevaluate their assumptions. Music, she realized, was more than sound. It was a language of emotion, a bridge between hearts and a reflection of life's experiences. And in that hall that day she had spoken fluently, authentically and powerfully. The famous pianist lingered for a moment, clearly reluctant to leave her side. Then he offered her a genuine smile. "You have a gift," he said softly. "Never let anyone make you doubt it." She nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but knowing that her journey did not depend on anyone's approval. It was her dedication, her practice, and her love for music that had brought her here. The recognition was welcome, but it was secondary to the truth she carried within herself. She walked back to the piano for a final bow, allowing herself to feel the emotion that had been building inside her for years. The audience rose in unison, some clapping so fervently that she could barely hear the piano beneath the sound. But she didn't mind. This was more than applause. It was understanding, admiration, and connection. It was a moment where human experience and music converged, leaving an impression that would linger long after the final note had faded. As she stepped away from the piano for the last time, she thought about the people who had doubted her along the way, not with bitterness but with clarity. She realized that those doubts had been essential. They had shaped her, motivated her, and forced her to develop a resilience that now defined her. Each late-night practice session, each critique she had faced, each small triumph had contributed to the performance that had just concluded. She had transformed all of it into a narrative that spoke through sound, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. The famous pianist followed her gaze and saw the audience, still captivated, still moved by her performance. He could not deny the impact of what had just occurred. Here was someone who had taken the simplest of beginnings, a single note, and expanded it into a story that had touched every heart in the hall. He had laughed at her once, but now he was humbled, having witnessed the depth, skill, and emotional truth that she had brought to life. She turned to leave the stage, but the audience's applause persisted. It was a continuous wave, a tribute to the authenticity and brilliance she had displayed. She allowed herself a moment to feel gratitude, not for the applause itself, but for the acknowledgement of her journey and the connection she had created. Music had the power to communicate what words could not, and she had harnessed that power fully. In that hall, in that moment, she had transcended doubt, ridicule, and expectation, leaving a lasting impression of beauty and truth. The famous pianist finally spoke aloud to the entire hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying authority and admiration, "we have witnessed something extraordinary. Talent, dedication, and authenticity come together in ways that leave us speechless. Today we have been privileged to experience true artistry." The audience erupted once more, their applause echoing through the hall, louder and more sincere than before. She felt a quiet joy, knowing that the impact of her performance extended beyond technique or recognition. It had touched lives. She walked down the stage, feeling a sense of peace and accomplishment. The journey that had begun with doubt, struggle, and late nights of practice had culminated in this moment of understanding, connection, and respect. She realized that her music was more than a personal pursuit. It was a way to communicate, to bridge gaps, and to convey emotion and truth to others. That realization filled her with humility and strength, affirming that the path she had chosen was the right one. The audience slowly began to file out, some lingering, unwilling to let the experience end. People approached her, offering congratulations, words of admiration, and expressions of gratitude. Each interaction reinforced what she had already known. The authenticity and dedication she had invested in her craft had made a profound impact. The famous pianist remained nearby, silently acknowledging her mastery with quiet nods and respectful glances. His presence, once intimidating, now served as confirmation of the recognition she had earned through years of effort. As she finally left the hall, the echoes of the performance and the applause followed her. She felt a mixture of relief, joy, and satisfaction. It was not simply about performing well. It was about conveying her story, her dedication, and her truth. The hall, the audience, and even the famous pianist had been touched, humbled, and inspired by what she had shared. And in that, she found a profound sense of fulfillment. Walking outside, she felt the cool air against her skin, a contrast to the warmth and intensity of the hall. Yet the feeling of accomplishment and connection remained within her. She understood that this was not the end but a milestone, a recognition that dedication, authenticity, and passion could break through doubt and judgment. She had proven not only to the world but to herself that persistence and love for one's craft could create moments of extraordinary beauty and impact. She took a deep breath, feeling gratitude for the journey, the challenges, and the victories that had brought her here. Every struggle, every moment of